So this is, of course, one of the most popular images and themes in all medieval art. And I imagine you have seen lots of images of the Annunciation, probably on Christmas cards and things like that. So you've probably seen lots and lots of images, but you maybe aren't so aware of how many poems and songs and things like that there are on the subject of the Annunciation. And these usually dramatise the dialogue between Mary and the angel. So we've been looking at plays, which are obviously dialogue too, but the Annunciation is often presented as a kind of mini play. And poems on the Annunciation vary quite a bit. Some are very sort of celebratory and fun and jolly songs, and others are more meditative and more reflective and focus on Mary's experiences at receiving this extraordinary message, this idea, you're going to be the mother of God. This is the next poem on the handout. I've chosen this one because it focuses on Mary's interiority, on her thoughts and her reactions. So it's, again, this is a story which does appear in the Bible, but you'll see that this takes a quite free approach to the biblical text. It paraphrases the dialogue, it gives them a dialogue that, words that don't appear in the Bible. And so Mary's own words from the Bible begin the poem, Ecce ancilla Domini, so behold the handmaid of the Lord, is what she says in response to the angel's message. So that's the poem's refrain. Ecce ancilla Domini, said the Virgin without vice, when Gabriel her greeted graciously, that holy pinnacle of proven price. From thee shall spring a full sweet spice. Then said the maiden full mildly, then since I am so little of price, Ecce ancilla Domini. Hail be thou, gracious without guilt, of all maids born the very best. Within thy body shall be fulfilled what all the prophets have preached so pressed. God will be born within thy breast. Then said the maiden full mildly, to me he shall be a welcome guest, Ecce ancilla Domini. But when she saw an angel bright, she was afraid in all her thought, and of his speech well wonder she might. Then said the angel, dread thee naught, a blessed tiding I have thee brought. Then said the maiden full mildly, as God wills, so be it wrought, Ecce ancilla Domini. That angel said, conceive thou shalt within thy body bright, a child who Jesus shall be called, who is great God's own Son of might. Thou art his tabernacle edite. Then said the maiden full mildly, since he said never else but right, Ecce ancilla Domini. Call him Jesus of Nazareth, God and man in one degree. He as a man shall suffer death, and reign in David's dignity. A blessed word he sends to thee. Then said the maiden full mildly, he shall be dearly welcome to me, Ecce ancilla Domini. When the angel was vanished away, she stood all in her thought, and to herself she then did say, all God's will shall be wrought, for he is well of all wit, as witnesses well his story. At that word the knot was knit, Ecce ancilla Domini. How do you think this presents Mary and her thoughts? What kind of thought process is she going through here?
Very welcoming.
Welcoming, yeah. She says that twice, doesn't she? She says, to me he shall be a welcome guest, and then he shall be dearly welcome to me. I like that phrase, a welcome guest, the idea of a baby as a welcome guest, because it's sort of like it's temporarily staying inside the body, but it's like for the mother, the unborn baby is a welcome guest that just stays with you for a little bit, and
It's almost as if she knows it somewhere deep inside herself, and so it's not altogether an overwhelming surprise.
There's a sense of, she is afraid, so she saw an angel, I think you would naturally be afraid, and the angel says, dread thee naught, so don't be afraid, but she does have a kind of reaction of fear, and then of kind of trust, isn't it? So, as God wills, so it be wrought. And that final verse there, when the angel was vanished away, she stood all in her thought. That's a kind of internal reflection. And to herself she then did say, all God's will shall be wrought. At that word the knot was knit. What do you think that means?
So as if that's the point of
Conception.
Yeah, I think that, yes, I think so.
But it's interesting because it's held up until then,
Yeah.
and it's only at the very end when she's gone through all these processes in her own mind. So it does give that strong impression of conception.
I think that's the idea, yeah. It's at that word. So her words of consent that the knot was knit. So it's not like it's already been done, but she consents and then it happens. And I think, so the knot was knit suggests like the conception, like the forming of the baby almost, doesn't it? Like a, exactly, a clump of cells in the body. And it can also mean something like the agreement was made, knot could describe an agreement. So it's quite an interesting kind of image to choose there, because it's an abstract image, but also it has a real kind of tactile feeling, doesn't it? If you think about a knot of things, it does evoke a little kind of clump of cells, or also a contract or an agreement that's been made that can never be undone. Something inextricable, and like a moment in human history that everything has changed and nothing will be the same again.
I suppose up to that point there was a feeling of she was humble, she trusted God, and therefore, she was willing to do His will. But at that point, she actually affirmed that why she was doing it.
Yeah, I think it's nice, isn't it, that it sort of gives her the ability to articulate that, that she does trust. She says, He is well of all wit, so He's the source, the well of all wisdom. That's her faith. That's what she's putting her trust in. She's kind of saying, well, if God wants it, it must be right, because He's God and everything He wills must be good and perfect. And she's saying, I will accept His will because I trust in that. So that's the reason of her consent.
It's very interesting the use of the word guest, because it seems to suggest that she's accepting that it's not no ownership.
Yeah.
Which other mother or father would say, my child.
Yeah.
She's not saying that.
That's interesting.
Like a vessel.
Yeah. Well, I think, but you could also think about it as being like he's a guest on earth almost. He's kind of entering from somewhere else, whereas a child, and a human child, is formed of the body of its parents. This is coming from somewhere else, so he is a guest, and just a kind of temporary dweller who is living inside her body for a little while and on earth for a little while, but actually he's something else. He's something very different. So it's some interesting kind of subtleties in that choice of word.
It's predicting the Nazareth birth that she wouldn't necessarily know about.
Yes, it's also, that's a good point, it's looking forward, isn't it? And notice it says, he as a man shall suffer death as well. So it's telling her the whole kind of everything to expect. So this poem imagines her kind of knowing that from the point of the Annunciation. And if we contrast that with the next poem, this is imagining Mary's thoughts during her pregnancy. So after the Annunciation, she's now pregnant and expecting the baby. And this is a simpler poem, maybe a carol, probably meant to be sung. And it starts, under a tree, in sporting me, alone by a woodside. So just like, lots of medieval poems start like this. I was walking out one day and I overheard. I heard a maid who sweetly said, I am with child this tide. Graciously conceived have I, the Son of God so sweet. His gracious will I put me till, as mother him to keep. Both night and day I will him pray, and hear his laws be taught, and every dell his true gospel in his apostles fraught. So like entrusted, I'll see him teaching his apostles. This ghostly case doth me embrace, without despite or mock, with my darling lulay to sing, and lovingly him to rock. Without distress, in great lightness, I am both night and day. This heavenly fold, in his childhood, shall daily with me play. Soon must I sing, with rejoicing, for the time is all run, that I shall child, all undefiled, the King of Heaven's Son. So you were saying not imagining it as her child, and here there's something a bit different, because she's very much thinking about my baby, what I'm going to do with my darling, and really imagining all the nice things about having a baby, isn't it? She's imagining playing with him, singing to him, rocking him, daily playing with him. So it's a very kind of positive expectation, very hopeful image of motherhood. All her thoughts are really positive. And I think it's interesting to contrast that to the previous poem, which has a suggestion of something darker down the line. There she's told he will suffer death one day, and also you see a little bit of her fear, a little bit of her doubt, and here there's nothing of that. This is just completely, it's all going to be great, everything's lovely. She's not suffering, she's without distress, in great lightness, so she's just kind of completely finding it all very easy. There's no shadow of grief here. But then, of course, the audience reading this poem might have different feelings about it. They might well think, well, they know that Mary will suffer in motherhood. She will have to watch her child die. So she's predicting the future here, but she can't predict the whole future. She's predicting the kind of early days of childhood and of his childhood and how that will be very nice. But you, as the reader, can either enter into that and feel the pleasure of that and her delight in her child, or you can think, that's lovely, but there's something else that's going to come later. We know that isn't the end of the story. But this is very much, isn't it, about the relationship just between Mary and the child. And she has a real sense, I think, of possession of her child here, actually. She mentions his laws, she mentions him having his apostles. It's kind of interesting she can even envisage that future. But it really is about her and what she wants to do with the child and how she's thinking about him. And this is a moment of just pure imagination, in the sense that there is, I don't think, anything in the Bible which suggests how Mary felt, while she was expecting the birth of the child. This is quite close to the time when she would give birth, because it says the time is all run. So this is like probably with kind of weeks or days to go before giving birth, and this is just imagining how she would be hopeful and optimistic at that time. But it's kind of only, of course, it's only one poet's imagination of what that would be like. But the whole point of this tradition is that it allows poets to think about those moments, to try and enter into these moments which are not given to us in Scripture. We're not told what to think about this or what Mary would think, but it's a kind of imaginative exercise. So there are these sort of spaces in the story where you can think, how would someone feel in that situation? What would it be like to expect that or anticipate that? Well, the last poems that we looked at this morning were kind of interested in dwelling on Mary's experiences, reflecting on Mary's experiences while she was pregnant. So when she knew she was expecting a child, the things she was imagining might happen. And that's obviously a kind of very personal and individual situation to imagine. But this period in her life, during her pregnancy, was also an opportunity for artists and writers to think about Mary's relationships to other women, other mothers, because she's kind of entering into a new stage of her life when she becomes a mother. And her experience, of course, is, in one way, it's completely unique because nobody else was ever the mother of God, but it's also something which gives her kinship with other women who have been mothers and had children. And so it makes her a figure who can understand this sort of wider female experience. So she was often seen as, naturally enough, an intercessor for pregnant women and for mothers who were encouraged to pray to her. And that kind of sort of bond between mothers and that female community is encapsulated really in the story of her visit to her cousin Elizabeth. So the story is that Mary has gone to see Elizabeth, her older cousin, and Elizabeth is also pregnant a little bit further along. Christ and St. John the Baptist were thought to have been born exactly 6 months apart. So John at midsummer first, and then 6 months later Jesus was born. That's how the church thinks about their kind of relationship between their births. And so that means their mothers were pregnant at the same time, but at different stages. And so when they meet, according to the Gospel story, Elizabeth says to Mary that her unborn child kind of turned over in the womb because he recognised that Jesus was coming. Jesus was unborn, but he could kind of sense his presence. So this moment is sort of partly about the meeting between Christ and his herald, St. John, who is going to then, when they're adults, go and sort of begin to spread the word of who Jesus is. But it's also about the meeting between their two mothers, these close relatives who are going through a very similar experience, and they have this kind of moment of sympathy and recognition between them. And you can see that medieval artists depict this as a very tender moment between these two women. So this is an alabaster carving. You see Mary on the left is touching Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is touching her as well, so it's sort of mutual moment. And then here they're embracing each other very closely. So it's a very affectionate kind of moment. And this was also represented in medieval drama. If you look at the handout, I've just given you a little bit from a play about the Visitation, where Mary goes to Elizabeth and says, "Ah, cousin Elizabeth, sweet mother, what cheer? Ye grow great. Oh my God, how ye be gracious. So ye grow great is like, oh, you're getting so big. It's like what people say to pregnant women. It's not always very polite, but that is what they say anyway. And Elizabeth tells her, anon as I heard of you, so as soon as I heard you coming, this holy greeting, meekest maiden and the mother of God, Mary, by your breath, the Holy Ghost us was inspiring, that the child in my body rejoiced greatly and turned down on his knees to our God reverently. So what that means there, that's inspiring in both the literal and the metaphorical sense of the word. So to inspire is to kind of breathe in. So it's saying that she's saying that Mary coming to her and sort of being as so close that they could breathe on each other is sort of breathing that knowledge of Jesus' coming almost inside her body, so that the child John in the womb can sense it. So it's a very kind of physically intimate moment as well as a sort of spiritually intimate moment, because it's inspiring her in the more general sense of the word as well, like, you know, with hope and joy. Whom you bear in your body, this verily I ken. So I know who you're carrying, carrying in your body. Fulfilled with the Holy Ghost, thus loud I cry, blessed be thou among all women. And then Mary in response speaks her Magnificat. Now used at evensong, but in the Middle Ages and in the Catholic Church used at Vespers, so it's a kind of daily, these days using the daily office of prayer. My soul doth magnify the Lord, my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Saviour. And in the play, she says it in Latin, so the audience would know it in Latin because it's one of the prayers that everyone would know. And then Elizabeth translates it into English in case anybody didn't know. So it's a nice kind of moment dramatically between, making it available to anyone in the audience, but also Elizabeth is kind of acting as an explainer for Mary and what she's saying. Just as John will be a kind of herald for Jesus, so Elizabeth is sort of like a kind of intercessor for Mary. And one of the things that the Magnificat says, God hath put down the mighty from their seat and hath exalted the humble and meek. So the point is that Mary herself, although she is humble, she's unpretending, she doesn't aspire to worldly greatness, she has been elevated to the position of the Mother of God, and the mighty, the powerful, will be humbled in the face of that. So it's partly, the Magnificat, about humility, about the reward that comes from not putting yourself first, but being generous, self-giving, humble, choosing to humble yourself. And that's what Mary does in this play for Elizabeth, or in this particular tradition. So she says, Cousin Elizabeth, I shall hear you keep, so I'll look after you, and these 3 months, so until the time her child will be born, abide here now, till ye have child, to wash, scour, and sweep, and in all that I may comfort you. So the story, as the Golden Legend tells it, is that she stayed with Elizabeth and she acted as midwife when Elizabeth gave birth. So they kind of had this last experience together. Elizabeth's last stages of pregnancy, Mary was with her, helping her, and she took up the child in her own hands, at the moment he was born. So that itself is a kind of model of humility, isn't it? If you see, she talks about scouring and sweeping the floor and washing, doing the washing up and that kind of thing. It's a very practical kind of service, but it's quite a humble, everyday, ordinary kind of service that people can do for each other. But then, of course, the Magnificat, the song of the Magnificat, promises that it's exactly that kind of humble service that will be elevated above all the pride and wealth and power in the world. And that's a kind of humility that Mary embodies at this stage in her life. So that's during her pregnancy. And then, of course, we have to talk about the Nativity. So the poems we were looking at this morning were kind of thinking about what Mary knew at the time that she was pregnant, kind of exploring her hopes for the future, her imagining playing with the baby in one case, or in the other poem, having a more kind of complicated understanding of this is a thing that's been prophesied, this is something I've chosen to accept, and this is now going to be my destiny. But there's also an interest in kind of among medieval writers in exploring the limitations of what she knew, or how she found or came to understand what it really meant for her to be the mother of this particular child with this special destiny. What kind of joy that was going to give her beyond ordinary joy of motherhood, and then also what kind of suffering it would bring because of the fate that he had chosen to come to earth, he'd come to earth to die. And that is often explored by medieval writers in texts which think about Mary's feelings in the days or weeks after he was born. So if you look at an image of the Nativity like that, that's very familiar iconography, isn't it? What kind of mood would you associate with the Nativity, with the birth of Christ? If I ask, if you think about Christmas carols or... Sorry? Joy, yeah, definitely. Yeah. But you often have, don't you, something like Away in a Manger, a very peaceful kind of sense. No little baby Jesus, no crying he makes. He's just lying there, the angels are looking at him, Mary's looking at him, the animals are praying. It's all very kind of calm and peaceful. And there are some medieval carols or poems about the Nativity which are like that. But actually there are others which explore the more challenging bits of the story. This growing realization that Mary has that this child's fate, that the fate of the child she already loves as her own child, is going to be a painful and a difficult one. So you have carols where Jesus is kind of imagined shivering in the cold, where Mary and Joseph are lamenting that they don't have anything to wrap him with, or the baby's crying because he's so uncomfortable. So they're not particularly joyful at all, actually, even though this is such a joyful event. And then you get something like the next one I've given you on the handout. So it starts, "This yonder night," and that means like the other night, just some unspecified occasion. "This yonder night I saw a sight, a star as bright as any day, and ever among a maiden sung, bye bye, lule, lule." So it's a kind of lullaby. Lule is sort of evokes a lullaby, but it suggests a vision. I saw a sight, a star as bright as any day. So if you imagine a really incredibly bright star, there's something sort of unearthly about that. It's a nighttime scene, but almost too much light. So that suggests something. The speaker is seeing a vision here. It's like imagine a flash of light, and then this is what he sees. "This maiden hight Mary," so this maiden was called Mary. "She was full mild. She knelt before her own dear child. She lulled, she lapped, she rolled, she wrapped, she wept without a nay. She rolled him, she dressed him, she lissed him, she blessed him. She sang, 'Dear son, lule.'" So all of those things, lull, lap, roll, wrap, dressing, and they're quite hard to translate, some of them, because they're all just the things you do with a baby. If you imagine you just have a baby and it's crying and you're trying to get it to stop crying, you might just kind of like pet it or stroke it or wrap it up in something. Just imagine all those different things that you might kind of do to try and tend to a child because he's crying. So she said, "Dear son, lie still and sleep. What cause hast thou so sore to weep? With sighing, with sobbing, with crying and with screeching all this long day. And thus waking, with sore weeping, with many salt tears dropping, lie still, dear son, I thee pray." We don't often think about baby Jesus screeching. I think that's a particularly interesting choice of word. And what she's saying to him, why are you crying? Again, that's something people say to babies, isn't it? If a baby's crying, parents are like, "Oh, why are you crying? Don't cry, it's okay." They don't, because you don't really know why a baby's crying, so you're just trying to, get to some kind of sense of what might be wrong. But in this case, the baby can respond, even though he's still very young. He answers the question, "What cause hast thou so sore to weep?" He says, "Mother," he said, "for man I weep so sore, and for his love I shall be torn, with scourging, with threatening, with bobbing, with beating, for truth, mother, I say, and on a cross full high hanging, and to my heart full sore sticking, a spear on Good Friday." This maiden answered with heavy cheer, "Shalt thou thus suffer, my sweet son dear? Now I mourn, now I muse, I all gladness refuse, I ever from this day. My dear son, I thee pray, this pain thou put away, if it possible be may." And that's where it ends. It ends in this very painful place that she's saying, he tells her, I'm going to suffer all these terrible things. And she's horrified, and she says, "Shalt thou suffer? Don't let this happen. I don't want to see this happen. but that's where it finishes. So he doesn't speak up or comfort her or anything. And there are some examples of this genre of poem which are much more detailed, where he will kind of prophesy for her his whole life. He'll say, when I grow up, first of all he'll say, kings will come to me and then we'll have to flee into Egypt, and then I'll grow up and I'll preach in the temple, and so his whole life will be told, including his death and then his resurrection. But this just focuses on his death. So it really focuses on the pain and the physical suffering that he'll endure, scourging, threatening, bobbing, beating. That just means, like, bobbing just means hitting. And then the hanging on the cross and the spear in his side. And her reaction is naturally just complete horror. And this is all made the worse, really, or the more painful, because he's still a very young child, clearly, as he's saying this. So again, as in the story of Mary being presented in the temple, you've got a baby or a toddler at the most saying this about himself. He will suffer in all these awful ways. So no wonder she is so upset. And this is a very poignant kind of image, isn't it? The idea of a child being able to foresee the suffering it's going to feel. And this is, so it's deliberately a disturbing kind of idea, a child that can speak of its own suffering. And you can see how the poem, in this particular case, it kind of piles up those verbs. First of all, where she's trying to do all these things she can to comfort him because he's crying and he just won't stop crying, and that's very distressing for her. Parents don't like that thing. It's really troubling. So, she's lulling and lapping and rolling and wrapping and trying to look after him, and he keeps crying and crying and then finally screeching. And then when he does speak to her, he doesn't comfort her. He gives her this even worse list of verbs: scourging, threatening, bobbing, all that awful thing that he's foretelling. And she's crying as well. Notice that she wept too. She's probably exhausted. So there's a real sense not just on his physical suffering, but also her physical attempts to comfort him and her own kind of pain. And the central question in this poem, and in a lot of poems like this, is really that, what cause hast thou to weep? Why are you crying? Or why weepest thou so sore? Some of the other poems phrase it. It's partly a thing people do say to babies, and people say it because they don't know, and a baby can't answer, and so a baby's cry is a sort of inarticulate appeal for help, whether they can't say what they need. So a baby's crying, they might be hungry, they might be cold, they might be just uncomfortable, and they can't express that. So it's a wordless appeal for help to the parent. So it's very much an instinctive thing, and it prompts an instinctive response on the part of the parent, isn't it? So we're not in the realm of even really rational discussion or people being able to say what's wrong, or you're thinking about the most instinctive kind of, almost like a need, an absolute need on the baby's part, and then a desire to fill that need on the parent's part. So the poetic conceit in this poem, though, and in others like it, is that there is a reason why Christ is crying. So babies cry for no reason, or for reasons that only they know, but in this case he's crying because he's come to suffer. For man I weep so sore. So there is a reason, and he can give her an answer. And in some other versions of this poem, it's not even Christ who's speaking, but just any baby. And the idea there is that every baby has a reason to cry, even though it doesn't know it, because it's been born into a world of pain, and so it will inevitably face some kind of suffering in its life. They've been born into what these poems tend to call a weeping world, so a world of trouble. And that's obviously it's a very poignant, very sad thought, and it's not something people want to think about when they look at a newborn baby. Babies are associated with hope and joy and possibility, but actually, nonetheless, it is true. And so medieval writers were often kind of interested in presenting uncomfortable truths, in saying, okay, you want to think that the life of a newborn baby will always be happy and peaceful and just joy and celebration, but that's not reality, and it's more helpful to be honest about the idea that actually the world is a difficult place. There is suffering in it as well as joy, and so all children will suffer something. And it's important in this context because that's exactly the human experience which Christ has come to share. So everybody suffers, and Christ, God, has chosen to be born on earth in order to suffer that human pain. so that people don't have to suffer anymore. So if you're thinking about how to imagine the Nativity, to imagine God being born as a human being, one way might be to take the kind of away in a manger approach and think, he doesn't cry because he's special, and so he's sort of something more than human. So he doesn't cry, his mother doesn't suffer in pregnancy, for instance, and so that there's some sign of his specialness in the lack of crying. But another approach, the approach these poems take, is to say, well, God was born on earth, and that meant he cried, because that's what babies do. That's what human beings do. They cry and they suffer. And so because he has come to share that suffering, you have to imagine him sharing even the screeching of a newborn baby that, can't be comforted. And it's quite interesting, I think, this can be quite difficult for modern readers. If you you take that and then you think about Christmas and all our associations with Christmas and joy and celebration and the idea that it's meant to be, for happy children and things like that. But that's sort of not necessarily how medieval readers thought about Christmas. There is some joy there, but if you're thinking seriously about the religious or the theological kind of rationale behind Christmas, you have to think that it's only the beginning of something which will end in sorrow, and then that sorrow will be replaced with ultimate joy. And so, for instance, this is what John Donne, going a little bit beyond the medieval, this is just something he preached in a sermon on Christmas Day. And I always think this goes very nicely with images like this one. He said, "The whole life of Christ was a continual passion. Others die martyrs, but Christ was born a martyr. He found a Golgotha where he was crucified, even in Bethlehem where he was born. For to his tenderness then, the straws of the manger were almost as sharp as the thorns after, and the manger as uneasy at first as his cross at last. His birth and his death were but one continual act, and his Christmas Day and his Good Friday are but the evening and morning of one and the same day." So if you sort of take Christmas seriously, you have to take those two things together. He's saying, you can't really just think about the joy and celebration of Christmas, you have to think about what will come after. And in a poem like this, it's Mary's emotions which are the entry into thinking about that, thinking about how awful it would really be for a mother to learn that her child is going to suffer that kind of pain. And it's interesting, I think, that this is put in a kind of lullaby form. What do you associate with lullabies? What kind of context do they belong to? What's their mood? What's their purpose?
Peace.
Peace. Yeah, to soothe the child is the idea, isn't it? To provide, to sleep, exactly, to get them to sleep, to get them comfortable and, to calm them down and give them comfort and help them feel safe and all of that. And that's the exact opposite of what this poem is doing. So it's taking the most comforting form of literature, maybe in the entire world, and making it uncomfortable, or introducing this note of discomfort and pain into it. So it's kind of, I think that the point here is to make you feel both all the associations that lullabies have of the intimacy between a parent and a child, and that sense of comfort and familiarity and coziness and falling not asleep and all of that, and then to say, but this pain is going to come, and in this case that's kind of the end of it. But of course that's not really the end of it, because actually the point, this is not suffering without a purpose. The purpose of the suffering this baby is describing is to be an ultimate kind of comfort, to provide, to put an end to human suffering, or to mean that human suffering doesn't lack purpose. And the whole point of this poem is really to be compassionate in the literal sense of that word, where you suffer with, or you feel with someone. So Mary suffers with her son. She is compassionate. She feels compassion for him. And we as readers are being invited to feel compassion for her as the mother trying to look after him and then learning this awful truth, and for him and for what he suffers. And then also the whole purpose of him coming to earth and suffering this is to be compassionate, to suffer with human beings in their inevitable troubles and pain. And that's the one comfort that the carol holds out, that Christ has come to earth to share suffering. and to suffer with mankind, and that's why he's crying. For man, I weep so sore. So you know, somebody reading this might be moved to weep for him, but he's weeping for you, for mankind, for us. You know. And the whole point of poems like these is to evoke emotion and discomfort and sort of poignancy and pain, really. And that's why they touch on these quite uncomfortable ideas of like a baby talking about its own death. Because if you can stir emotion or tears or feeling, you are creating a powerful emotion that will then attach the reader to this child who has come to suffer for you, you know, and then you feel that it was for me. You feel a personal connection to the child. And a love for children, or a kind of interest in children, or a tenderness to children, is a sort of one of those natural, innate, instinctive kind of things that affective piety was trying to harness, really, because you know, most people feel a natural attraction to children, or if you hear a child cry, you know, you kind of have a reaction to that, even if it's not your own child. You might well feel sort of sorrow for the baby, or you want to calm it down, or something like that. You know, there's a sort of a physical, biological reason why people respond to a baby's cry, and that's what these kind of poems are trying to kind of evoke, really. And the love between a mother and the baby in particular, and between Mary and her baby, is the most natural instinct of that kind. And so Julian of Norwich talks about this when she says that this is why she talks about God as our mother, because he became a child to his mother and experienced mothering from Mary in order to become a mother to everybody, so by his life on earth and then his death. So she says, we know that all our mothers bear us to pain and to dying, but our very mother, our true mother Jesus, he, all love, beareth us to joy and to endless living. So the point is that you kind of go through the pain, through his pain, you come to joy.